What most people in the Christian tradition, what we're not as familiar with, are the chapters that follow this wonderful scene in which Moses receives the Ten Commandments. Because in the chapters that follow, you can almost imagine Moses up there taking notes or something, because he is instructed in page after page after page in the Bible about the rules for the Jewish people's cultic practices, of how they're going to live their lives, the purity codes, and all these things. In other words, the religious laws of Moses' people. And in Exodus 25 to 31, in all of those chapters, they were given minute instructions on building the tabernacle. This was the place where God promised to dwell in the midst of the Israelites. It was going to be a visible sign of the abiding presence of God. Think of it as a sort of portable Mount Sinai, if you will. God's glory, we're told in Exodus, had rested on the mountain in a cloud. Upon building the tabernacle in Exodus 24 and also in chapter 30, near the end of Exodus, God's glory would fill the tabernacle, at least the inner part, with what they described as a kind of cloud. In this way, God would be with the people in a real and material way as they traveled through the wilderness. We're not talking about the temple yet, we're talking about the tabernacle, which was a very elaborate tent-like structure. The trouble is that while Moses was up there being instructed, the people down in the valley got restless. Imagine that. And they decided that he wasn't coming back. They wanted something more concrete in their lives, let's say. Something a little bit more defined to be able to worship, or in this case, something a bit more gold. So they built themselves a golden calf. And as the scripture puts it, they sat down to eat and drink and then rose up to play. In short, they were having a roaring good party until, you know who comes hiking down the mountain. God had informed Moses of what his people were up to, while Moses was still taking notes up there on Mount Sinai. And so Moses, up there on Mount Sinai, had done some really, really quick pleading and a bit of bargaining with God to prevent the whole bunch down in the valley from getting wiped out then and there. And upon his return, Moses asked Aaron, the man he left in charge, just how this golden calf idol thing came into being. And even though Aaron had already done some really impressive stewardship programming to get people to cough up their gold to melt into a statue, Aaron suddenly blames it on the people. They made me do it, he said. I just tossed gold into the fire, and lo and behold, out came this golden calf. That's pretty good. You should go into politics. Well, I won't go into detail about some of the nasty things that happened to some of the, shall we say, lax members of the Congregation of Israel. But by the time we get to today's reading, God was pretty fed up with this undependable and rowdy bunch and was reevaluating how much of a future presence God was going to have with them. So instead of planning to continue being personally with them in their journey around the wilderness, God tells Moses that an angel instead is going to be assigned to go before them as the tour guide. As the scriptures put it, go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, or I would consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. God's holiness is such that it will not abide sin as being a part of the program. So Moses tries to do a bit of damage control, and he enters the tabernacle that was on the edge of the campground, what with all the rather bloody cleaning up that had occurred earlier inside the camp. And this is where today's reading happened. In one of her commentaries, Karen Schifferdecker, who's an assistant professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary up in St. Paul, she quotes Eugene Peterson's paraphrased translation of the Bible to catch the tone of this exchange that happens. Moses says to God, Look, you tell me, lead this people, but you don't let me go. You don't let me know whom you're going to send with me. You tell me, I know you well, and you are special to me. Well, if I'm so special to you, let me in on your plans. That way, I will continue being special to you. And don't forget, this is your people, your responsibility. Moses, to put it mildly, which is kind of hard to put with Moses, he was rather dramatic. But Moses, to put it mildly, is not satisfied with this new arrangement of God being distant. And Moses has chutzpah. Chutzpah. There's no doubt about it. He's not afraid to use the Lord's own words against the Lord. Remember, God, that you made this promise, right? Okay. Moses is persuasive. The Lord gives in some. Our translation this morning in verse 14 says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. But in the Hebrew itself, there's no with you in that verse. And so Moses, like a dog hanging on to a bone, isn't willing to let the argument end. And that's why he keeps pushing God about the matter. Moses insists that God be explicit with God's promises. In verses 15 and 16, he says, if your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? Moses wants that intimate relationship he had had with God to be continued for the sake of the people. He realizes that without this presence, he can do nothing. Moses doesn't listen particularly well the first time around. You may have noticed in the scripture reading, and God has to kind of repeat what God had said, and finally it sinks in. And finally God concedes in fully. And the Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight. I know you by name. In other words, God knows that Moses is being genuine. Not a bad accomplishment, Moses. Not bad. So, of course, what does he do? He pushes the envelope a little bit further. Show me your glory, please, he says. Now, the literal meaning of the Hebrew here for glory is weight, not W-A-I-T, W-E-I-G-H-T. He wants to see the inner reality that makes God who God is. The inner reality who makes God who God is. This, however, he's told, is more than any mortal can bear. And so, as the glory of God passes by Moses, he's protected in a cleft of the rock by the hand of God, who allows him to see God only after God has passed, to witness the back of God. Moses is a model in many ways for our spiritual lives and for our lives as a church together. Early on, when he was called to go back to Egypt, for example, he was called to go back to Egypt and to advocate before Pharaoh on behalf of Moses' enslaved people. He cried out that he wasn't a good public speaker. I stutter, he says, and I make all sorts of excuses. And God sent him anyway. And in the doing of what he thought he couldn't possibly do, in turning it over to God and trusting bit by bit while mumbling on the way, he found his voice. Or rather, we should say that he found God's voice. So even if we do what we are called to do, what our conscience says we need to do, even though we may at times mumble along the way, God is gracious. God is gracious, and God has a pretty good sense of humor, too, putting up with us. When we speak from our own agendas, and for the sake of our own interests, especially when they're at the expense of others, then eventually we trip up our him oppressive and divisive. We see thousands, tens of thousands of people now all over the world increasingly gathering to confront the selfishness and the corruption that helped to bring on the economic suffering being endured by millions, nay, billions of people across the globe right now. We said Moses had chutzpah. Wonderful Yiddish term, I believe it is. But it wasn't boldness for his own sake. It was for his people. A people that he had left as a young man when he had fled from Egypt, and a people to whom he showed little enthusiasm for returning. Until, of course, he began listening to God more than to his own benefit and comfort and predictability. Maybe we need to have more chutzpah when we finally decide, often after trying everything else, to actually listen to where God may be calling each of us into some form of ministry. Maybe we need to talk back to our inner voices that keep saying, you can't do that. You're not good enough. You're not faithful enough. You're not informed enough. You're not Christian enough. So enough with enoughs, right? Moses could have said, well, our relationship with God is going to be reduced now, folks. We're cutting back. We're not as faithful as our forebears. We've really messed up, and so now we've got to settle for a spiritual life that isn't going to include the intensity of God's presence as we once had. It is just plain harder now being religious. But Moses had something in him. Perhaps a hunger as much as firm faith. And he wanted more. He needed more. He was crying out for more. And his people needed more. Maybe our hunger is as much a part of our faith as whatever it is with which we are satisfied and settled and confident. Moses didn't win his argument with God because he was so sure of himself. His chutzpah was bold as much because of his wanting to not let go, to not have to walk the walk alone, as it was because of his beefy resume or his impressive accomplishments or his certainty. And so he reached high. Show me your glory. And in so doing, he discovered the real glory of God. What's left behind after God and the ways of God have gone by? The justice and mercy. The blessed community embracing the least among us. The faithfulness that discovers real faith by making mistakes and trusting God. Moses discovered that what matters is what's left behind among us in the wake of God's will and God's way being